The sound of clinking plates mixed with soft jazz music as Mai wiped down the last table of her evening shift at Golden Palace. The restaurant's red lanterns cast a warm glow across the worn wooden floors, and the aroma of ginger and soy sauce still lingered in the air. Just another Tuesday night in downtown Manhattan, where dreams came to either soar or sink. Between serving bowls of wonton soup and refilling water glasses, Mi's fingers couldn't help but dance across her serving tray. Bach's Prelude in C major played softly through the restaurant's old speakers, and her hands moved instinctively, muscle memory from countless hours of practice taking over. A few regular customers had started noticing her little habit, the way she'd pause mid-step when Chopin came on, or how she'd correct the timing under her breath when the kitchen radio played Mozart slightly too fast. What these customers didn't know was that just 6 months ago, Mai had been sitting in Juilliard's practice rooms, her fingers flying across pristine grand pianos instead of serving trays. But life had a way of rewriting the music. Her mother's sudden illness had forced her to make a choice: continue pursuing her degree or help with mounting medical bills. The choice had been simple, even if the reality of it wasn't. "Order up for table 8, called out Uncle Lee from the kitchen. He wasn't really her uncle, but he'd insisted on the title since her first day. The elderly cook had a sixth sense for knowing when she was lost in thought about her old life. Mai quickly grabbed the steaming plates of honey walnut shrimp and chow mein. As she carefully balanced the dishes, she noticed her reflection in the restaurant's front window, still wearing her grandfather's old watch, a reminder of his words: "Music lives in the heart, not in the concert hall." The night grew quieter as closing time approached. While cleaning up, Mai found herself humming the piece she'd been composing during her breaks. It was different from the strict classical pieces she'd grown up playing. This one had elements of the sounds that now filled her daily life. The rhythm matched the sizzle of the wok in the kitchen, while the melody carried hints of the traditional Chinese music Uncle Lee played during prep time. A customer at the corner table looked up from his laptop, curiosity crossing his face as he heard her humming. He was a new regular who'd been coming in for the past few weeks, always ordering the same thing: dumplings and jasmine tea. There was something about the way he listened to her humming, really listened, that made her slightly self-conscious, but she brushed the feeling aside. Later that night, as Mai counted her tips and changed out of her work uniform, she found an unexpected note tucked between the bills. Written on a napkin in neat handwriting: "Your music speaks louder than words. The world deserves to hear it." She carefully folded the note and slipped it into her pocket, right next to the overdue notice for her mother's hospital bills. Tomorrow would be another long day of double shifts, waitressing here and teaching piano to neighborhood kids. But tonight, walking home through the busy streets of Manhattan, Mai let herself hum her composition a little louder, letting it mix with the symphony of the city. The man at table 17 had become as much a part of Golden Palace as the faded Chinese zodiac placemats and the lucky cat figurine by the register. He'd show up every Tuesday and Thursday precisely at 7:30 p.m., laptop in hand, and always dressed in simple black clothing that somehow looked expensive. Mai had started calling him Mr. 17 in her head, though his credit card receipts read Robert Tang. Tonight, like clockwork, he sat at his usual spot, but something was different. Instead of immediately opening his laptop, his attention seemed focused on the restaurant's speakers. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 was playing, one of May's favorites, and she caught herself swaying slightly as she arranged table settings. "The tempo's a bit off on this recording, isn't it?" he commented as she brought his usual order of dumplings. Mi's hand froze mid-pour while refilling his tea. Most customers couldn't tell Rachmaninoff from Beethoven, let alone notice subtle timing issues. "The second movement should breathe more," she found herself saying, then immediately bit her lip. It wasn't her place to critique classical music with customers. But Mr. 17's eyes lit up with interest. "You play?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Used to, Maid replied, keeping her voice casual as she adjusted the soy sauce bottle. A lifetime ago. Through the kitchen window, she could see Uncle Lee giving her a knowing look. He'd been trying to convince her for weeks to talk to this particular customer, claiming he'd seen the man's face somewhere important. But Mai had learned to be cautious about people who showed too much interest in her musical background. As the evening progressed, more customers filled the restaurant, creating the usual dinner rush symphony. Chopsticks clicking against plates, bursts of laughter, the whoosh of Uncle Lee's walk in the kitchen. But Mr. 17 remained, nursing his jasmine tea, his food long finished. During a quiet moment, he spoke again. "That piece you were humming last week, it wasn't classical, was it?" Mai nearly dropped her serving tray. She hadn't realized anyone had been paying attention to her absent-minded humming. "Just something I mess around with sometimes," she said, straightening the napkins on a nearby table. It had an interesting structure, he continued. The way it incorporated environmental sounds, like the kitchen rhythms, reminded me of some contemporary composers I've worked with. Before Mai could respond, a large party came in, and she had to rush off to help arrange tables. When she finally had a moment to breathe, she noticed Mr. 17 was gone. In his place was his usual generous tip, but this time accompanied by a business card. The card was simple. Black text on cream paper, but the company name made her heart skip a beat. Harmony Heights Records, one of the most respected classical music labels in the industry. Below the company name was a handwritten note. "Real talent doesn't need a concert hall to shine. Call me when you're ready to share your music with the world." Mai slipped the card into her pocket, right next to the folded napkin note from last week. The weight of both felt somehow significant, like the first few notes of a piece she didn't know she'd been composing all along. Later that night, after the last customer had left and she was helping Uncle Lee close up, he finally spoke what had been on his mind all evening. "Sometimes," he said, wiping down his beloved wok, "the best opportunities come disguised as ordinary moments, like good tea leaves hidden in simple water." Mai smiled, thinking of the business card in her pocket. Maybe he was right. Maybe some dreams don't die. They just simmer on low heat, waiting for the right moment to come alive again. The hospital hallway seemed longer than usual as Mai walked towards her mother's room, clutching a fresh bouquet of daisies from the corner store. The flowers were a small luxury, bought with the generous tips from last night's shift. Her footsteps echoed against the linoleum floors, mixing with the steady beeping of medical equipment, a different kind of symphony than the one she was used to at Golden Palace. Her mother was awake, looking smaller than ever against the white hospital sheets, but her eyes brightened at the sight of the flowers. "Ah, you shouldn't waste money on these," she said in Mandarin, though her smile said otherwise. "The doctor says you're getting stronger," Mai replied, arranging the daisies in the window. She didn't mention the stack of medical bills in her apartment, or the eviction notice that had appeared under her door that morning. Some notes were better left unplayed. Later that evening at the restaurant, Mi's hands shook slightly as she served plates of kung pao chicken and fried rice. The business card from Mr. Tang felt heavy in her pocket, but pride kept her from reaching out. She'd left Juilliard on her own terms. She couldn't bear the thought of asking for help now. Uncle Lee noticed her distraction. "You're stirring up storms in that head of yours again," he said in Cantonese while showing her how to fold dumplings during the afternoon lull. "Sometimes the hardest piece to play is the one where we ask for help." Before she could respond, the front door chimes jingled. A well-dressed elderly man walked in, carrying a leather briefcase that had seen better days. He was one of their regulars, Mr. Chen, who played piano at fancy hotel lobbies across the city. "Bad news," he told Uncle Lee. "Can't do the weekend performance. My arthritis is acting up something fierce." He flexed his fingers demonstratively, wincing at the movement. Uncle Lee's face fell. The weekend performances had become a tradition at Golden Palace, drawing in crowds who came as much for the music as for the food. Friday night is our busiest time, he said, looking worried. All the reservations. The ancient upright piano in the corner seemed to watch the scene unfold. It wasn't anything like the grand pianos at Juilliard, but Mai had often caught herself staring at it during quiet moments, fingers itching to touch the keys. "What about you?" Mr. Chen asked suddenly, noticing Mi's gaze. "I've seen you tapping out rhythms on your serving tray. You play, don't you?" Before Mai could protest, Uncle Lee jumped in. "Play. She's better than good. Used to be at Juilliard before." He trailed off, catching himself. The evening rush began to pick up, saving Mai from having to respond. But as she moved between tables, she could feel the weight of possibility settling around her like dust motes in sunlight. The piano's silence seemed louder than ever. After the last lunch customer left, Mai found herself standing in front of the piano. Her reflection in its scratched wooden surface showed dark circles under her eyes, evidence of too many double shifts and sleepless nights. The eviction notice deadline loomed just 2 weeks away, and her mother's next round of treatment wasn't covered by insurance. She lifted the keyboard cover, revealing ivory keys worn yellow with age. A few were chipped, like old friends who had weathered too many storms. Mai pressed one key softly, then another. The notes rang out clear and true, if slightly out of tune. Uncle Lee appeared beside her, holding out a dust cloth. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the universe gives us a push when we're too scared to jump." He nodded toward the piano. "Friday night. What do you have to lose?" Mai looked at her hands, calloused now from carrying hot plates instead of practicing scales. The business card from Mr. Tang was still in her pocket, along with her mother's latest medical bill. Perhaps Uncle Lee was right. Sometimes the scariest leaps were the ones that led you home. Friday evening arrived with a thunderstorm, but it didn't stop Golden Palace from filling up. The usual dinner crowd mixed with weekend regulars who'd come expecting Mr. Chen's piano performance. Rain tapped against the windows, creating its own gentle percussion as Mai moved between tables, her heart beating in sync with each drop. The old piano sat in the corner, freshly dusted. Uncle Lee had even called in a favor to have it tuned that morning. "A gift," he'd said with a wink, though Mai knew the tuning probably cost him a day's profits. At 7:30, right on schedule, she spotted Mr. Tang sliding into his usual seat at table 17. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a small nod. She hadn't called the number on his business card yet, but somehow his presence made her more nervous than all the other customers combined. "Ladies and gentlemen," Uncle Lee announced at 8 p.m., his voice carrying over the dinner chatter. "Unfortunately, Mr. Chen cannot perform tonight." A murmur of disappointment rippled through the crowd. "But," he continued, eyes twinkling, "we have something special instead. Our own Mai will play for us." The restaurant fell silent. Mai felt her cheeks burn as she untied her apron with trembling fingers. The short walk to the piano felt like crossing an ocean. As she sat down, she caught her reflection in the dark window, still in her waitress uniform, hair slightly messy from the humid evening. Her fingers hovered over the keys. It had been months since she'd played on a real piano, though she practiced countless times in her head while serving dishes and wiping tables. The silence in the restaurant grew heavier. Then, like a whisper from her past, she remembered her grandfather's words. "Music lives in the heart, not in the concert hall." Taking a deep breath, she began to play. She started with Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece she'd played countless times before, one that felt like coming home. The old piano's slightly worn keys responded to her touch like old friends. As she played, the restaurant's ambient sounds, clinking plates, whispered conversations, even the rain outside, seemed to weave themselves into the music. When the final notes of Debussy faded, she didn't stop. Instead, her fingers found their way into something new, the piece she'd been composing in her head during countless shifts at the restaurant. It started softly, like morning prep time in the kitchen, then built gradually like the growing bustle of the lunch rush. She incorporated everything: the rhythm of Uncle Lee's chopping, the sizzle of the wok, the cheerful ring of the front door chimes. The melody flowed between classical structure and the Chinese folk songs her mother used to sing, creating something entirely new yet somehow familiar. A plate clattered somewhere in the kitchen, but instead of breaking her concentration, Mai wove that sound into her piece too. This wasn't Juilliard's pristine concert hall. This was real life, with all its beautiful imperfections. She didn't notice Mr. Tang quietly pulling out his phone to record. Didn't see Uncle Lee wiping tears from his eyes as he stood in the kitchen doorway. Didn't notice how every single conversation in the restaurant had stopped, replaced by something rare and precious, the sound of dreams taking flight. As she played the final notes, letting them fade like the last customers leaving at closing time, the silence that followed felt electric. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the applause started, not the polite kind she'd heard at recitals, but real, raw, and spontaneous. Someone whistled. Another person shouted, "Encore." When Mai finally looked up, she saw her whole world transformed. Regular customers who'd never known her as anything but their waitress were standing, clapping. Uncle Lee was beaming with pride, and Mr. Tang, Mr. 17, was already walking toward her, phone in hand, wearing an expression that said this was just the beginning. But what touched her most was the sound of the rain, still falling outside, now seeming to applaud along with everyone else. In that moment, she realized that sometimes the most beautiful music comes not from running away from who we are, but from embracing every part of our story, even the parts that seem out of tune. The morning after her performance, Mai woke up to her phone buzzing nonstop. At first, she thought something had happened to her mother, but instead, she found hundreds of notifications flooding her screen. Mr. Tang's video had gone viral overnight. Waitress transforms restaurant into concert hall. Read one headline. Another declared, "Hidden genius serves both dumplings and Debussy." The video showed her in her work uniform, completely lost in the music, while plates clinked softly in the background. Something about that contrast seemed to capture people's imagination. When she arrived at Golden Palace that morning, a small crowd of people was already waiting outside. Some held phones, hoping to catch another performance. Others just wanted to eat at the table where they'd seen her sitting in the video. Uncle Lee was beside himself with excitement, showing everyone who walked in the exact spot where his me had played. "Look at these comments," her coworker Lynn showed her during their break. "They're calling your piece Rich Notes because of how you mixed in all the restaurant sounds." The name stuck, spreading across social media like wildfire. Mr. Tang, or Robert, as he'd asked her to call him, finally revealed his full identity: head of classical music development at Harmony Heights Records. "I've been looking for something fresh," he explained over a cup of jasmine tea. "Classical music needs new blood, new stories. When I heard you humming your compositions while serving dumplings, I knew you had something special." But success wasn't as simple as signing a contract. The classical music world could be harsh, especially to outsiders. Some online commenters dismissed her as a social media gimmick. "Just another viral sensation," they said. "Not real classical music." Those comments stung, but Mai found strength in unexpected places. Her regular customers defended her fiercely online, sharing stories of how they'd watched her compose the piece over months of service with a smile. Uncle Lee started a wall of encouragement in the restaurant, where people could leave notes for her. One afternoon, while taking a break from recording sessions, Mai visited her mother in the hospital. She brought her laptop to show her the video that had started it all. "Ah yeah," her mother exclaimed, watching her daughter play on the small screen. "You mixed in the sound of the wok. Your grandfather would have loved that." She paused the video, pointing at Mai's expression while playing. "That look, that's exactly how he used to look when he played at weddings back home." The comment sparked something in Mai. She'd been trying so hard to prove herself to the classical music world that she'd almost forgotten why she fell in love with music in the first place. It wasn't about perfect concert halls or critical acclaim. It was about telling stories through sound. She began incorporating more everyday sounds into her recordings, not just restaurant noises, but the whole symphony of her life. The hum of hospital machines became a gentle bass line in one piece. The rhythm of subway cars transformed into percussion in another. Each song told a story of where she'd been and who she'd become. 1 month after the video went viral, Golden Palace hosted a special event. Mai performed her growing collection of pieces on the same old piano, but this time with professional recording equipment set up by Harmony Heights. The restaurant was packed, with people standing shoulder to shoulder between tables. As she played rich notes, now properly arranged and refined, but still carrying the soul of that first spontaneous performance, she noticed something beautiful. The audience wasn't just listening. They were part of the music. Every cough, every whispered comment, every clinking glass became part of the composition, just as they had been all those months when she was creating it in her head. A food critic who happened to be present wrote later, "In an age where classical music often feels trapped behind concert hall doors, here was something revolutionary. A piece that invited the whole world in, teaching us that beauty can be found in the most ordinary moments if only we learn to listen." Life had taken on a strange new rhythm. By day, Mai still helped at Golden Palace when she could. She couldn't bring herself to fully leave the place that had shaped her music. By night, she worked in recording studios, trying to capture the magic that had made her viral video special. The hospital bills were finally getting paid, and her mother had been moved to a better room with a window view. But new challenges emerged like unexpected key changes in a familiar piece. Recording studios felt sterile compared to the warm chaos of the restaurant. Professional musicians struggled to understand why she wanted to include the sound of sizzling woks and clinking plates in her compositions. "Maybe we should clean it up," one sound engineer suggested, trying to filter out what he called background noise from her recordings. "Make it more professional." "But that's the whole point," Mee insisted, thinking of all the life stories she'd witnessed while serving tables. The elderly couple who came every Sunday to share dumplings, speaking little but saying everything through gentle smiles. The stressed-out students who found comfort in bowls of noodle soup during exam weeks. These weren't background noise. They were the heart of her music. One evening, after a particularly frustrating recording session, she returned to Golden Palace. The dinner rush was in full swing, and without thinking, she grabbed an apron and started helping out. Uncle Lee didn't say a word, just smiled and handed her a serving tray. As she moved between tables, she overheard a young girl asking her mother, "Isn't that the piano lady from the video?" Before Mai could feel embarrassed, the girl added, "She's even cooler in real life. She can carry 4 plates at once." That comment sparked something in Mai. She'd been so worried about proving herself to the classical music world that she'd almost lost sight of what made her unique. She wasn't just a pianist, and she wasn't just a waitress. She was both, and that was her strength. The next day, she called Robert with an unusual request. "I want to record in the restaurant," she said. "Not in a studio. Right here, with all the real sounds, the real people." There was a long pause before he replied, "That's never been done before." "Exactly," Mai said, thinking of the young girl's comment. "That's why we should do it." The logistics were complicated. They had to figure out how to set up recording equipment without disrupting service. The health department had concerns. Some of the classical music producers were skeptical. But Robert stood by her decision, remembering what had drawn him to her music in the first place. They scheduled the recording for a regular business day. No special arrangements, no asking customers to be quiet. Just the natural symphony of restaurant life. Mai played between serving tables, her fingers moving from plates to piano keys and back again. Some customers from the viral video days came to be part of the recording, bringing friends and family. During one take, She was playing a particularly moving passage when she heard a crash from the kitchen. Instead of stopping, she incorporated the sound into her piece, just as she had that first night. The recording engineers looked panicked, but Robert was grinning. He understood now. This wasn't about making perfect music. It was about making real music. The day's final recording session stretched into evening service. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the restaurant's front windows, May played her signature piece, Rich Notes. But this time, it had evolved. It carried not just the sounds of the restaurant, but the stories of everyone who had been part of her journey. A food critic who had become a regular wrote in his blog that night, "In a world of auto-tune and digital perfection, here's someone brave enough to embrace the beautiful messiness of real life. Her music doesn't just play alongside the world. It welcomes the world in, transforms it, and plays it back to us in a way that makes us all feel a little more connected." The lights of Carnegie Hall glowed softly in the evening mist. Mai stood backstage, peering through the curtain at the filling seats. Her fingers unconsciously tapped out rhythms on her waitress apron. Yes, she'd insisted on wearing it for the second half of her debut performance. "Ready?" Robert asked, adjusting his tie. In the years since that first viral video, he'd become more than just a producer. He'd become family, even joining the weekly Sunday dinners at Golden Palace. Her mother sat in the front row, finally strong enough to leave the hospital. Next to her was Uncle Lee, wearing a suit for the first time since his own wedding 30 years ago. The entire staff of Golden Palace had closed the restaurant for the night to be here, along with dozens of regular customers who'd watched her journey from the beginning. The first half of the concert had been traditional. Chopin, Debussy, Rachmaninoff. She'd played them perfectly, proving to the classical world that she belonged. But the second half, that would be different. As she walked onto the stage in her concert dress and waitress apron, a mix of confused murmurs and knowing chuckles rippled through the audience. A few people who'd seen her viral video started clapping early, recognizing what was about to happen. Music, she spoke into the microphone, her voice steady despite her racing heart, isn't just about perfect notes in perfect halls. It's about life. Messy, beautiful, unexpected life. She gestured to the side of the stage, where kitchen equipment had been set up alongside her piano. What happened next would be talked about in classical music circles for years to come. As Mai began playing Rich Notes, Uncle Lee started cooking at his portable wok station, the sizzle and clang becoming part of the performance. The sounds were picked up by carefully placed microphones, mixing with her piano just as they had in the restaurant. The piece began softly, like early morning prep time, then built as imaginary customers arrived. She wove in fragments of classical pieces, a hint of Chopin here, a touch of Beethoven there, but transformed them with the rhythms of real life. The smell of Uncle Lee's cooking drifted through the hall, adding an unexpected sensory dimension to the performance. In the middle of the piece, she stood up from the piano and walked to a serving station, picking up a tray and incorporating its sounds into the music. The audience watched, mesmerized, as she demonstrated how she composed the piece, finding music in every movement, every clatter, every moment of her double life. The performance reached its peak when she returned to the piano, playing with one hand while balancing a serving tray with the other, a feat that had taken months to perfect. The message was clear. She wasn't choosing between her two worlds. She was bringing them together. As the piece neared its end, she spotted the young girl from the restaurant in the audience, the one who'd been impressed by her plate-carrying skills. The girl was beaming, probably realizing for the first time that there's no single path to following your dreams. The final notes faded into silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then the applause began, building like a wave until it filled every corner of the historic hall. People were standing, cheering, some even wiping away tears. A few classical music critics looked stunned, but most were smiling, won over by the sheer authenticity of what they'd witnessed. Mai took her bow, then gestured to Uncle Lee to join her on stage. As they stood there together, the waitress turned pianist, and the cook who'd believed in her, she remembered something her grandfather used to say: life is like a great symphony. The beauty isn't in playing every note perfectly, but in making even the unexpected notes sound like they belonged there all along. After the performance, back at Golden Palace, they held an impromptu celebration. The restaurant was closed to the public, but fuller than ever, filled with family, friends, and the entire journey that had led to this moment. Someone had propped the door open, letting in the sounds of the city night. Mai sat at the old upright piano, now restored but still bearing the scratches and character of countless meals served around it. As she played one last time for the night, she realized that success wasn't about escaping her old life. It was about embracing every part of who she was, every note of her story. The music she made that night wasn't for Carnegie Hall or record labels or viral videos. It was for the clinking plates and sizzling walks, for hospital rooms and late-night practice sessions, for every person who'd ever dared to find beauty in the ordinary moments of their lives.